Learning disabilities is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It was part of my training. Back when I received my credential, learning disabilities was a category, and that was what I had my expertise in. And then God gave me a son with a learning difference, and he came after I had my credential and had been teaching a while, so I was pretty much prepared for him. Of course, every child is unique, so I had to go through a few ups and downs with his disability, but we're working through it. And I've had a strong interest, let's go up to the open slide, a strong interest in brain imaging and brain research, because I really wanted to get to the heart of why these children are different. One of the things that we found, what I found in the classroom when I started working with kids, especially at middle school, the students would say, well, we're retarded, we're in the retarded class. I said, no, you're not. Why do you think that? And they said, well, that everybody tells us that we are. They point to the door, that's the retarded classroom. I said, oh, okay, wait a minute. So I got out their IQ scores and I showed them, look at your strengths. And I explained what they meant. I explained what the numbers mean and where their strength areas were, and not just their weaknesses. And they had never been told that before. And I thought, this is not good. So that's why advocacy is such a big thing for me. The students need to know that. They need to know how their brains are working. And then they know what they need to compensate for or how they can get better. But my fundamental belief is, of course, that what the teacher does for the student, and the student, if they're along with good motivation and really good effort, we can improve the brain. And now they're finding, this was 20 years ago, with research that is true. The brain does change. So that's pretty cool. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Does anybody know what the first one is? What is it? Right, 3 degrees below zero. Very good. How about the next one? Once around the block, good. How about the next one? See, everybody's getting it now, huh? How about that, number 4? Backwards glance, yes. Number 5? Hand in hand. 6? Just between you and me. 7? Who said it? I heard it. Paradox, correct. Paradox. And what's the last one? I chose this activity because it illustrates how kids with learning disabilities learn. They see the world differently. And the reason why they flip letters and they read words backwards, they see the world in a different way. And what we're asking them to do is our traditional way to read. And I noticed that a lot of you started to pick up on it, and then you said, oh, after about the second one, I heard oh, now I get it. I get the pattern, I get how it works. So the role of the teacher is to translate that for our students and to show kids with LD, even though it looks this way, this is what it is, until they can repattern their brains. And the exciting thing about brain research is it actually changes the neurons and changes the patterns and the inner working of the brain. It's very exciting. Just to give you a little background, this is how, of course, how we were trained in the learning disabilities, and you may already be familiar with a lot of this. Way back in 1917, Hinshelwood looked at neurological dysfunctions in the brain, and particularly men who were coming back from World War I with brain damage. And he said, oh, all of a sudden they couldn't read, they couldn't speak. They had the kind of disabilities that kids were showing in classrooms who also couldn't read. And so he looked at those brains, what was different. And of course they didn't have brain imaging, so he could only do it through autopsy. But he found that the studies of their disabilities, when they lost it, many areas of the brain were still intact, but he said the damages were attributed to specific centers of the brain. So very, very beginnings of brain research. And then he studied kids who couldn't read, and he said they had congenital word blindness. So word blindness, he said, is inherited. Often he noticed it in families, which we know is true, and with LD it is something that's inherited. And that there was damage in the brain somewhere where letters and words were stored. So then Orted in 1937, he continued that research and developed an explanation for reading disabilities. And he's pretty famous for that and has also developed a good intervention program for it. He proposed that reading difficulties were caused by delay or failure in the establishment of dominance for language in the left hemisphere. He was actually on the right track, which is what we have found when they've done the MRIs. Although this kind of led to that belief that there's two sides of the brain, and I'm right-brained and I'm left-brained. And the more we look into how the brain functions, there really isn't a left brain or right brain. There's a lot of information that goes through the brain. But there are certain functions that tend to be located in some areas of the left side and some areas of the right. Although we've had anomalies where they've removed an entire hemisphere of the brain, for example, for students with epilepsy, they've taken that whole side of the brain out or cut the connection between the two so they couldn't communicate, and the other side of the brain will compensate and take over those functions. So the brain is amazing. It's amazing in how plastic it is, but they have found that it isn't. You're not a right brain person or a left brain person. You may be more artistic and may be more adept at some things, but we can't say, you really cannot give an assessment for someone who's left brain or right brain. There's no such thing. The remediation that came about because of Orton was that systematic and explicit instruction combined with intensive skill building practice using letter-sound relationships or phonics, which is what Orton is famous for. And he was on the right track. That's absolutely true, and that has been shown through many years of research to be very, very effective for kids who can't read. They need that intensive, explicit instruction. And you're going to see later on that it does actually change the way the brain functions. He coined the term streptosymbolia for the twisted symbols that we see with kids where they twist the letters and they actually see them different. And he said, again, this was because the confusion between the two hemispheres. He said neither side was dominant, therefore there was confusion there. Then the remediation that came out from that again is that systematic explicit instruction, which we now know is true and really does work. But neither of the theories about neurological basis for reading disorders was widely disseminated in the scientific and educational circles. And so it really didn't gain popularity, which is too bad because it was very effective. His method was right on, and now we know it was right on. But back then in the 40s and 50s, schools attributed the problems of students who didn't read or couldn't do math and had learning disabilities to environmental problems, parental problems, attitude problems, and educational problems. Basically, you were told that you were lazy. And we have a colleague, Joan Levine, who just won a Teacher of the Year with the Learning Disability Association, the Sam Kirk Award. And she has a PhD now, but she has severe learning disabilities and has overcome them, and obviously because she has a PhD. And she was raised during that era, during the time when you were told that you're stupid and lazy. Her parents told her that. So she had to overcome a lot to be able to go on and say, no, I'm capable, I'm able to do it. And she, in her speech, she talks about, those that were at the session yesterday, I played her speech. She talks about the mentors and the people that got behind her and said, no, you can do it. So good thing we know now that this is true. But that was it was a real gap in our educational system. And I know when I became a teacher, I had parents who would say, oh, I had the same learning problems. You know, we'd tell them about, we'd read their psych report and read their assessment report and say your child has a learning disability. And the parent would say, well, I had the same thing, but I didn't know what it was called. Because during the early schooling era, during the 40s, 50s, and even 60s, and on into the 70s, there still was a question about that and not real good services for kids. So luckily, things have changed. So the next branch of research was Werner and Strauss. They did base their work on Goldstein's injured soldiers during World War I, so they went back to that old research. And many patients were unable to respond to perceptual stimuli, so they had damage in those areas. And they also had hyperactivity, ADHD, often associated with learning disabilities, and they had emotional ups and downs. So he said, well, these students must have brain damage. He continued that line of thinking. And said also, he noticed that the IQ scores of children who did not have disabilities would go up over time, but students who had learning disabilities, their IQ scores would go down. What he didn't pick up on was the fact that the IQ test has a huge verbal component or a school skills component. Do you have any psychologists in the group here? So do you know what I'm talking about? That score is going to remain flat if the students are not educated. They're not receiving really good instruction, correct? So he missed that. He said, oh, look, their scores are going down. That means that there's some kind of brain damage. So that was not the best way to approach it. So he recommended that a child's approach to a learning task be studied and instruction tailored to the deficits. That was the good news. That's the best thing that came out of his research, because that's right on. Each child is different. We need to watch what they're doing. Although we can make some generalities about learning disabilities, in many cases we have to really watch the students and see what they need. That's really critical. These were fundamental to the development of instruction for LD. So the whole field has kind of grown from their research in that sense. But bad news is a lot of their research had many flaws. And they assigned the brain damage and brain damage. That label was a bad thing. It was something that was carried on for quite a while. So that was the bad news, but the good news was their ideas about instruction were right on. Kephart in the 1960s added to this theory, and he showed that perceptual motor development was the basis for higher mental development. So this was the era of perceptual training, and this is kind of what I got when I was learning to teach. There were programs that trained children in drawing and tracing lines, standing on balance boards. Anybody remember those days? That was the thing. So at this time, researchers began to study auditory language processing, so they brought in the language component and began to develop theories of the central nervous system dysfunction in these areas. So it was partially on the right track, but instructionally very poor. Really did not lead to children becoming better readers. Learning disabilities became a field in the 1970s. In the early 60s, Sam Kirk proposed the term and defined it as describing children with disorders in the development of language, speech, reading, or communication skills, which were not explained by physical disabilities such as blindness, deafness, or some other physical impairment. Even though he brought that up, and then it became codified in IDEA in Public Law 94-142 in the 70s, there still was no clear-cut way for identifying these kids. We know they're not learning to read, we know they're not learning math, they're struggling in school, but how do we know? What do we use as an assessment? So it wasn't as clear-cut as other fields. In the 60s and 70s then, several assessments were developed for visual perception and psycholinguistic abilities, and that's where right on for what I was trained to do as a teacher. And remediation of LD were those activities. We had packets for the kids, tracing lines, learning to see things differently, figure ground experiences, listening to tapes where they had to try to discern a sound. So a lot of that was right on, but some of it was way off, and it was sort of a waste of time. And now that I know much more, I feel very guilty about some of the kids I had in my early classes. So the belief was that if you could rewire the brain, then the skills would transfer to academic skills. That was right on, and they have found with brain research that that is correct. So again, we're still searching for an answer. It's partially on the right track, but not quite. This is where the real progress began to occur in LD. And in 1988, I remember going to a strategic instruction model training from the University of Kansas, and my eyes were opened. The light bulb went on, suddenly a whole new world opened. Their research, and this is also where I got my PhD, their research was based on the fact that students with learning disabilities were lacking that executive function or the ability to have inner speech and to plan and to pick out what's important. So they were struggling in terms of organization, mental organization, so executive functioning, self-regulation, all the things that good readers were picking up very quickly. This did not mean that in the early years we didn't need systematic explicit instruction in phonics and spelling. They still needed that, but also they needed to learn how to learn. They didn't know how to catch on to school. So this was excellent training. So not only were they getting skills, but they were learning how to absorb those skills, how to use those skills, where to apply those skills in a classroom. And we were moving into the right track. So they didn't have brain research to support it, but they had evidence that kids were getting it. Kids were learning. They were becoming more organized. They were able to finish they were able to advance in comprehension, be able to finish reports, be able to understand content material in classrooms. So this line of research has continued to today, and it has been shown to be very effective after 30 years or more of data that they've collected. So metacognitive strategies that have executive functioning skills included improves learning. And Swanson in 1999 did a huge meta-analysis on the strategies research and showed that it's very effective. So today, where are we today? Technology has just brought us into a completely new era. In the 2000s, researchers Fletcher, Simons, Shaywitz, Pu, and Papanicolaou at University of Texas, Houston, summarized research using functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this is where the medical model is coming into the educational model, and the two come together. The images developed by these researchers showed clear differences in neural activity depending on whether a student could read or not read. So this is really fascinating research. Other researchers noticed, Joseph, Nobel, and Eden in 2001, they found that patients who acquired learning disabilities through true brain damage, through accidents, or some type of trauma to the brain, only developed those pathways when they started word recognition tasks. So basically, the print was given to the person tried to use that print and have their brain function, and the brain developed its own pathways, and those pathways were not correct. So it's just something we don't understand. Why is the brain choosing that pathway and not the one that most people use? And it showed that the activation was in that visual area. So for some reason, the brain sees the words and activates the visual area instead of the language area. So what instruction does is changes those pathways, uses the visual, and then says, now you gotta run a little route over here to language and have both of them work together. I thought this was really interesting. Just for fun, I looked at what's happening in brain research, and I ran into this page on the internet, so I thought I would copy it for you. This shows how current brain research is and how exciting it is. And maybe if you're just in the education field, you may not run into these things because they're more medical and science orientation, but if you look there, you'll see these are informing our practice, which is why I thought of doing this session. These are things that we can use in a classroom. So here's just some titles that are headlines today. First evidence of brain rewiring in children. Reading remediation positively affects brain tissue. So they're proving that. Remedial instruction rewires dyslexic brains with lasting results. So once the patterns are redeveloped, they stay that way. Remedial instruction can make strong readers out of poor readers. Brain imaging study reveals. So it's all along the same path, a continual support for this. So what it's telling us is that we need to have really good teaching and we need to do it effectively, and we can make a difference. Obviously, brain image is changing the landscape of what we do in the classroom. Dr. Timothy Keller and Marcel Joost have studied 35 third and fifth graders. They did pre and post brain scans, and they, after 6 months of intensive reading, the scores improved. So we are not at the mercy of our biology. This is good news for teachers, good news for kids in the classroom. You can learn. You can change the wiring. You can learn to read differently. And every one of these researchers has said the brain is plastic. The brain can adapt. The brain can learn. And one of the things I've been reading about recently is about older people, which is good news for me. As we age, we thought the brain just goes into this decline. And I've seen those little charts, maybe you've seen those. Oh, your peak is in your 30s or 40s, and then we're gonna drop off, and that's it. Your brain will just decline. And they're finding that that's not true. Doing puzzles, keeping the brain active, social connections, all of that continues to build new connections. The brain is not declining. I mean, there are some things that aren't as sharp as reaction speed and things like that, physical things. But the brain doesn't have to decline like that. So that's really good news for us elder people. So how does this translate to the classroom, which is what the conundrum that I think we're facing. I'm facing training teachers, and teachers are facing working with those kids. Should we continue brain mapping research? Well, I think that it's very effective. I think it's telling us a lot. Is it something that we're going to be doing in schools? Probably not. I can't imagine that would happen, but it is informing our practice, and it's something that teachers need to pay attention to, and school personnel need to pay attention to. Another idea I came up with is that we should adopt the philosophy that all children with learning disabilities can learn. And as I said before, I did the session yesterday on advocacy and the struggles that Joan Levine had to go through throughout her life feeling that she couldn't learn. But we need to adopt the philosophy that these kids can learn. I think all kids with disabilities, the IDEA philosophy is that we can affect some change, and we don't give up on any kid ever. And that's our philosophy. But we need to make sure that in schools that's the philosophy. There's no child that's hopeless or helpless, and we can't affect change with appropriate instruction. And the response to intervention model was very controversial in the field of learning disabilities. And at first I wasn't so sure that that was something I was interested in and would accept, and that would be something I'd buy into, but it really has grown on me, especially with the backing of brain research. How many of you are familiar with the response to intervention model? Almost everyone, not everyone, so I'm going to explain what that is. The new philosophy, well, the way students with learning disabilities used to be identified was they were given an IQ test, and hopefully the IQ test would come out in the 100 range, 80 to 100, or to 120, that normal range, and they would show a discrepancy in their work, the achievement, so they called it ability achievement discrepancy. So they were achieving a couple grade levels lower than they were capable of, they would say that's a learning disability. The problem with that model was that kids from 70 to 80, we called it the gray area, our gray kids, the gray kids wouldn't qualify because they're achieving at their brain what they said was their ability level. So why should we do anything special for them? Well, the new idea, the response to intervention is all kids who struggle, every one of them, we don't give them an IQ test, we don't worry about that. We look at kids who are struggling, and all kids get intervention. All kids get intensive intervention, and it's done in general education. So the first line of defense is, in general education, teach better, teach longer, teach deeper, whatever you need to do. See if you can affect a change. And if a child doesn't respond to that intervention, and it has to be over a significant period of time, perhaps 6 months, and I recall I've had teachers who in kindergarten would say, this child's got a learning disability, put him in special ed. We can't do that anymore, which is awesome. And the other thing that doesn't happen anymore, it shouldn't happen anymore, is when I was a teacher, I noticed most of my students were coming in second and third grade. I said, well, what are they doing in first grade and kindergarten? Well, they were waiting for them to fail. They'd say, well, let's wait, let's see how they do in kindergarten, first grade. So by second grade or third grade, they're grade levels behind. They've never learned phonics. They haven't learned those basics and didn't have any intervention because the teachers would kind of just push them aside. Oh, they're slow learning. So then it was a lot harder to catch up. So instead of that way of thinking with response to intervention, we apply interventions immediately, as soon as possible. If they come in right from preschool and we notice a difference, we affect change right then and there. And level 1 is the general ed teacher. Level 2 would be you go to an IEP meeting, a student study team, and you have other specialists come in and tell you, here's some ideas for the general ed teacher. We have general ed teachers in here? Any? Good. Does this happen at your school? Good. That's awesome. So the teacher would get some support. Okay, I'm trying everything, all the good stuff I know, and something isn't happening here. The child's not achieving. So then they give them some ideas. They might provide after-school support, early in the morning support. The child gets a little bit of extra instruction, still in general education. Then if that doesn't work, again, over a long period of time, 3 to 6 months, whatever you feel, kind of judge it per student and per situation. Then you might talk to special education and say they might need something more intensive. So it's a response to whatever you're doing. That's how they determine if a child is really having a disability. And the idea behind this, I went to a session with Don Deschler and Doug Fuchs and all the key researchers, and I was very skeptical. I said, what are we going to do without our IQ test? And their idea was that it would really get intensive instruction sooner in a child's educational career. And that was the intent of it. Some school districts still identify students using that ability achievement discrepancy. And personally, as a special education teacher, I liked the IQ information. I liked that because that's when I could have that conversation with the child or with especially my adolescents about their strengths. When my son's IQ was taken, first time he was identified in first grade, and they gave him his early IQ test. He had language delays. And his nonverbal IQ was off the charts. It was amazing. She said his block design was a 9, which was equivalent to 190, I guess, IQ. Am I saying that correctly, psychologist? Very high, right? A 9 is a 19, that's it. 19, not a 9, 19. So 190 is the way I looked at it. I said, oh my gosh, there was a line across the middle for 100, and then they had the chart that went way up for all those visual skills, putting blocks together, seeing a picture arrangement. He scored in the 19s. But verbal, he wasn't speaking. So, objectively, I would look at this child and I knew he had a problem, and I took him to the school and he was assessed. And yes, he had a language delay, but without that IQ score, I would not have realized what strengths he had. And as he got older, he started to show evidence of those strengths. He would take our video machine and slow it way down and watch frame by frame. And he started to look at the explosions in Star Wars and say, look, Mommy. And I thought, that's how he's thinking visually, which is what they're seeing on the research here with autism. And I thought, well, maybe that's what's going on with him. Maybe he's got autism and he needs visual supports. So as a parent, I was doing this diagnosis at home, wasn't getting as much support in the schools for that. They just classified as learning disability because he had an achievement ability discrepancy. So in a sense, that IQ score was very helpful. So I'm not saying that I would like to see that go away, but that is something that is a new trend in the schools. Response to intervention is the big thing, and the advantage is that kids are getting more intensive instruction sooner. In my opinion, disadvantages, we don't get those assessment scores. And finally, we need to collect data on kids. The more intensive data we have, and I tell my teachers this, you have to have data to back up that you've done that instruction. Show day-by-day progress. Keep records. The same thing we do with positive behavior support, where we're keeping track of behaviors, do it with data on achievement. That has to be done, so we have to take that achievement more seriously, because we know we can affect the brain, we know we can change it. We know from research that it can be rewired, and we don't have to think that it's going to be lifelong, although some disabilities persist lifelong. Joan Levine still has trouble spelling, and she talks about that a lot, but she's an excellent editor. She can see visually when a word isn't right, and she knows it's wrong. It's amazing. So where I have read through a whole thing and skipped some things and not caught it, she'll catch it for us. So she's our best editor. So there still are some things that we don't understand that we still need to look at. As the researcher said, we don't understand why that processing is slower in the words. We don't know why. But it's amazing what we can do now and what we're learning. And I think brain research is something I would really encourage teachers to follow. It's very exciting. I really appreciated this session. Thank you. I learned a lot from you. Okay.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.